Chemists work very hard to create new products, and they're very good at it. It's never been their responsibility to ask, is the molecule I've just designed likely to be toxic? They don't do that. That's not been viewed as their work. So what happens? They invent a new molecule. A manufacturer realizes, oh, that's a neat molecule. I can use it to make something really valuable. It goes into the marketplace. It expands in the marketplace. It becomes highly valuable. Lots of money starts to be made off of it. And 10 years later, some toxicologist says, it's in our bodies. What might it be doing? So there's this time gap between invention and taking it to market and beginning the toxicological tests, which inevitably leads to a battle. It's a battle between the people who are making money off of it, who say, oh, we've been using it for 10 years and we've never seen a problem, and the scientists who begin to ask the right questions, because some of these questions are quite complex.
Society had an impression in the past that we didn't need to worry about chemicals, and nature would take care of it. If you threw the chemicals on the ground, the sun would break them down, or the bacteria would break them down, or they would become dilute in the water and not dangerous. And we didn't know that that was not always the case.
What's new about these chemicals is they are not known to us. In other words, they come in under the radar, if you will, and enter our bodies subversively without our knowledge. And so this makes a problem for the study of these chemicals, because you cannot ask. You could ask somebody, did you smoke? Did you take this and this and this? But you can't ask, did you take phthalate, because you don't know. So I think the attack that we're under is a silent entrance of large numbers of chemicals into our bodies at levels that we don't know and whose effects we don't know. So it's a very kind of scary experiment that we're part of, I think.
We were surprised even to see banned pesticides in the food that we can buy at my grocery store.
No. Everywhere. Everywhere. Every sample one could imagine taking anywhere in the world, air, water, soil, human blood, we will find these chemicals. Totally circumnavigating the globe. They are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. We use them because of their surface active properties. The fluorine atom itself has a very unique property. It's very selfish with electrons, so it pulls things in. That tends to repel water, and it repels lipids, soil, oils. And so these fluorinated chemicals are unique in the whole world at being able to repel water and repel lipids, which make them useful for coating fabrics and carpets and paper. It's nice to eat a hamburger without having the grease go through the paper. And so we've become accustomed to those useful properties. The same properties that make them useful also lead to problems in the environment, in that these chemicals are spread around the world because the fluorine actually does impart the ability to evaporate. They're much more volatile. They can fly very readily. But it also enhances their longevity, how long-lived they are in the environment. We refer to that as persistence. They're highly persistent. Some of these compounds will not degrade under any mechanism that we know of, under our lifetimes, won't degrade at all. So they, in many ways, they redefine persistence. And certainly, many of your viewers will have heard of persistent organic pollutants. Most of those, like DDT and PCBs and the brominated diphenyl ethers, last a year or 10 years or maybe 20 years. These compounds, we have no idea, but much, much longer than that.
They are acting perhaps more on the immune system, or they are acting to weaken cell walls because of their effect like a surfactant, like a soap. They may affect the cell wall's integrity. So that effect, it may be quite different from the flame retardants. What does it mean when you have both in your blood? I don't think anybody knows that. So from the point of view of the fish in the waste stream or in the river that's not too far away from the waste effluent, it doesn't matter whether it's persistent or not. There's continuous flow of it, so it's always exposed.
The cocktail effect is a description used to for the situation when many chemicals act together, like in a cocktail of drinks.
I think we're only just beginning to realize how important that cocktail effect is. It's extremely difficult to study. It's expensive, time-consuming. But what the animal studies, very carefully conducted animal studies, have shown is that when you take these chemicals at levels at which individual chemicals have no effect, then together they can have big effects. And again, the effects that we're talking about that have been studied so far are on male reproductive development, so they will include this time window of vulnerability. And the implications of that are enormous, because it means that when you look at one chemical that we may be exposed to low levels of, and which is, you may think this will have no effect, you can't look at it like that. You must say, what else are you exposed to, and how will those add up?
So we did an experiment with cells, and we found that that was quite an astonishing finding. We find that when you combine the hormone, you see an effect, but the hormonal strength can be enhanced considerably if you then also expose to a large number of chemicals, but at concentrations where each of them individually doesn't cause any effect.
So you move in a what we call dose additive way from no effect on each of the chemicals to combining them and having a very large effect. So I think it's something that everyone is familiar with. If you go to the doctor, your doctor says, what else are you taking before I prescribe this, right? But we don't do that with the chemicals.
In animal experiments, the first effects that we saw in animals was not cancer, but was effects in the reproductive system. And one of the effects was a type of feminization of male mice. So male mice got some characteristics of female.
PCBs can affect the brain, lead can affect the brain, mercury can damage the brain, and we don't know how to estimate the damage to the exposure when there's a little lead, a little mercury, a little PCB, a little dioxin. Does it keep building, or is there a synergistic effect? Does it add one to the other? Maybe we'll be lucky and there'll be a negative effect, but I don't think that's likely.
There are hundreds of chemicals in the environment that are coming from products that we are using every day. And these chemicals were declared safe dozens of years ago. And now we understand that they can disrupt the endocrine system, the controlling system of our bodies.
Well, our hormone systems are very complex, and everybody must understand it goes beyond the usual sex hormones. There are a lot of hormones. Insulin is a hormone. I don't think most people understand that. And we have an epidemic of diabetes and obesity, all connected, in the Northern Hemisphere, that now, basically, some of the most recent studies, and even a human study, showed a link between a very commonly used plastic called bisphenol A and diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular problems.
What we used to think was that we could use high-dose testing to predict what's going to happen at low levels. That's how all regulatory toxicology works. We used to think that that was sufficient. But that was before we began to realize that some contaminants, like bisphenol A, behave like hormones. And the people that study hormones, endocrinologists, have known for years that what happens at high doses isn't necessarily the same as what happens at low doses. So all of a sudden, as toxicology is confronted with this new way of looking at chemical action, they have to throw out one of their most basic assumptions, that the dose makes the poison.
The numbers are so small that they're beyond the comprehension of most people. That's how small they are. So you think of a part per thousand, a part per million, a part per billion, a part per trillion. A natural hormone, below a part per trillion, it can stimulate breast cancer cells to grow. And now we are seeing chemicals like bisphenol A that are what hard, clear plastic is made out of, and the lining of cans is made out of. It can stimulate breast cancer cells at below a part per trillion, just like the natural hormone.
Definitely timing of exposure is very critical, and it doesn't take much. But we know now, as more and more people are working with the developing system from the time the sperm enters the egg until either the chicken hatches or the mammal or the human is born, we're just beginning to understand that chemistry. That chemistry operates in the range of parts per trillion and parts per billion, which industry has told us for years it's harmless. Concentrations like that are unimportant. But when you interrupt a vital system, something that's developing where these eggs are splitting and developing and budding and forming legs and arms and duct systems and glands, at a part per trillion, these are very dangerous chemicals.
The easiest concept for people to remember is that this hand and the fin of a dolphin and the wing of a bat, at the early embryo stage, they look identical. And inside of the wing of a bat and inside of the fin of the dolphin is a hand. So at the beginning of development of a fish or a frog or a mouse or a human, the early stages of development that are disrupted by endocrine disruptors and the genetic mechanisms are almost identical. We end up looking different, but don't let that deceive you. The mechanisms of development are very, very similar, and the disruption events of development lead to diseases in all of these species.
One of the big developments has been for us to identify that there is a critical period during development of the male fetus when there is extreme vulnerability to disruption of hormone production or action. And it's quite a narrow window. It's based on animal studies, but we've got very good evidence that the same applies to the human.
We have proven that in animals, if you expose during the time that you start out, your body starts out as one single cell and then becomes 2 cells and 4 cells and many cells. And we know that as one cell is becoming many other cells, the hormones that control that, if you disrupt them, then you permanently alter the genes in the new cells. And when you do that at the beginning of life, those cells and all of the cells that come from them are defective. And the consequence is that, for instance, after puberty, when the reproductive system starts forming, abnormalities in the organs that after puberty begin to develop, like the female uterus, suddenly you start to see diseases of that organ. You don't see the disease in a child because the uterus is not functioning yet.
So not just one system. This could be the development of the brain, which basically the brain at that time is getting programmed for how an individual is going to develop later in life as well. So their behavior is being affected. Intelligence could be affected. And you know, we talk a lot about nurture, but you can't, nurture definitely can make you learn to love. It helps you learn to love. But if you're not wired correctly in the beginning, nurture isn't going to work. And these are the things that I worry about. I see so many children today who don't relate. They can't look at you. They're totally, totally out of control. They overreact. They don't know what's right and wrong. And it's not because someone hasn't tried and worked hard for them. The parents are not to blame. The blame lies in the chemicals that were in the mothers' and fathers' bodies when they were conceiving that child.
Every generation before our generation was not living as long as we are living and not as healthy as us. And now what we are seeing is the younger generation with tremendously higher incidence of cancer, of obesity, of diabetes, of neurologic disorders of brain and behavioral abnormalities, of immune disorders. All of these are caused by environmental endocrine disruptors. And the incidence of all of these diseases in our children are much higher than in my generation.
Alltså vår generation, vi var ju kemikaliefria när vi föddes. Men våra barn är inte kemikaliefria när de föds. Men det finns ju också i samhället, alltså man säger att vi är friskare än någonsin. Och det stämmer säkert på vår generation. Men stämmer det på våra barn? Är de friskare än någonsin? De har otroligt mycket allergier och inlärningssvårigheter och frekvensen av cancer hos barn har ju ökat otroligt alltså.
At the population level, we are now able to count the percentage of children that are born with these kinds of disorders. And the list is growing. And it starts with ADHD, autism, diabetes, early childhood cancers, early childhood behavioral problems, which we now list as diseases in the United States. A juvenile crime is a disorder that can now be related back to prenatal exposure. We've got early cancers, testicular cancers in boys, obvious birth defects, no doubt that this damage happened before birth.
Breast cancer has increased, testicular cancer has increased, as you know. Reproductive problems have increased as well. Obesity is an epidemic in the United States, and behavioral problems, and autism. And you know what? Endocrine disruptors in animals can do all these things. So you can create obesity, you can create altered behaviors, you can create cancer, and you can create reproductive problems.
Meine Generation, wir sind die ersten Eltern, die schon das alles in sich haben und es an unsere Kinder weitergeben. Meine Kinder sind 5 und 7 Jahre alt und wir haben es jetzt sozusagen ihnen weitergegeben. Und wir wissen fast nicht, was es bedeutet, aber es könnte möglicherweise sehr viel bedeuten. Ich meine, sie haben keine roten Flecken auf der Haut oder sie haben nicht, dass ihnen die Haare ausfallen, aber es könnte sein, dass ihre geschlechtliche Entwicklung gestört ist, ihre sexuelle Entwicklung. Es kann sein, dass ihre intellektuelle Entwicklung gestört ist. Das hat man alles gesehen.
As we've shown in our babies, they're born with a large number of chemicals in their body, and it's not just the breast milk. They are born that way. In our infants, as young as 2 months, we had 50% with 7 or more phthalates measurable. So it's, you know, the placenta does not protect, which used to be, of course, what was thought. And, you know, it goes right in and it circulates and might even, and this is something we're just exploring now, be stored at higher levels in the fetus than in the mother.
Välkommen!
What you have in the mother, you have much of it, you may have in the baby, not necessarily all of it, not necessarily all type of chemicals, but a lot of chemicals pass the placenta, and so exposure starts very early.
People do not realize that there are critical periods for development of different systems. And for example, us men, we not only have masculinized reproductive system, but we have a masculinized brain. But when those two events occur is completely different. The reproductive system masculinizes in this early time window, the brain masculinizes late in pregnancy.
Most of the chemicals that we're concerned about pass from the mother's body through the placenta into the fetus. They also are stored in fat, and when a woman is nursing, she uses the chemicals in her fat along with the fat material to feed her babies. And if you measure a woman who is lactating, you will find a dramatic drop in many contaminants in her body as she is nursing her baby.
The mother is sharing what she has in her body with the baby so that these chemicals are in the baby as a gift from the mother prenatally. And it's not a very, and the mother has no control over this.
It's sad for mothers to have to face this dilemma. And the answer is get rid of these chemicals, and we won't have this horrible choice mothers have to make.
I think that these last 100 years, as these chemicals have come into the marketplace, the human race has experienced a period of the most rapid molecular evolution in the history of the species.
This is what we call a paradigm shift, a complete change in thinking.
We know that there is a thing called evolution, and we know that if you affect reproduction, then the species, the continuity of the species would be interrupted. Yeah, we can go to extinction. I don't know whether that is the worst case scenario, but I wonder if, like my rats that have been exposed, you know, some humans will have the same problem. I don't know who would be the people that are least exposed and would be surviving. I don't like the idea of selecting people according to their chemical burden.
Well, quite frankly, Stefan, having looked very closely at how climate change is a big threat, and everyone is very concerned about this, these chemicals that are causing the problems that we are seeing now in laboratory animals and now able to trace into the human picture are also derived from, again, those same fossil fuels that are causing climate change. And if you look very closely, we're getting into the 4th and the 5th generation now of children who are affected. Look at the odds of those children ever being born without having some kind of a lifetime disorder where they're going to have to be cared for or they're going to have to take medication the rest of their lives. I would say, quite frankly, we should be more worried about these health effects. They are going to be more imminent in terms of human society and humankind and all living organisms on Earth than the threat of climate change. It's going to get us sooner.